Good morning, everyone. My name is Gail Day. I am the Executive Manager at the Free Market Foundation. It's my pleasure to introduce Bouwe van der Eems to you. He is Chairman of the Pestalozzi Trust, which is a civil rights organization for home and civil education. Today, we are launching the 6th in a series of 8 booklets titled Laws Affecting Small Business. The series was first published by the FMF in the late 1990s, so a long time ago. As red tape sadly continues to hinder business and therefore the economy, we have updated the series, which deals with the following topics: finance, health, justice, labor, land, licensing, schooling, and tax. Bouwe will be presenting schooling. Thank you, Bouwe.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Gail, for creating this opportunity to talk about the thing that keeps me busy every day, namely education, and more specifically, home education. So Gail has already introduced me, so let me start sharing my presentation immediately. Okay, is my presentation visible for everybody? Oh dear, it's in the middle of the...
It's perfectly visible though, so when you get to the beginning...
it's not on the first slide. Okay, yeah, so the title of my presentation is we need regulatory reform in South Africa to unleash the potential there is to improve our education. So everybody's in agreement that our education is in a bad state, and there are various solutions being discussed. But before that can happen, we need regulatory reform. So, so my point, so my agenda is I was first going to describe the problem, then the education landscape. So the education landscape has changed significantly over the last 20 years. And I'm going to give an overview how that looks like, and then how the current regulatory environment looks like, and then proposals that are being promoted by various people, and then some principles on the way forward. So a lot of people agree that our education system is in a state of crisis. We spend above average on education, so lack of money is not the problem. But there's very little consensus on how do we fix this problem. So I'm going to attempt to give some guidelines on how to move forward. So I'm just making 2 bold statements. So the world has changed dramatically over the last century, but education is not. So we're still using the school system, and specifically the public school system is still the dominant form of education that has been used over the last century. But everything, the business has changed, every sector has changed, but education hasn't changed. The school still looks like the same. But changes have started in 1996. So in 1996, the SA Schools Act made provision for a limited form of home education. And that started a whole chain reaction of home education growing and all kinds of other forms of education exploding, which has changed the landscape dramatically. And this was visible for everybody to see during lockdown, where the school system showed itself to be a fragile system that's not capable of handling disruptions, and where other forms of education have proved themselves to be anti-fragile. But although the education landscape has changed, education policy has not changed. So here is a view of a pictorial view of the education landscape. So on the right-hand side, you've got this big bubble, and that is the public and independent schools. So before, I first want to unpack the term school, so that when we talk about this term school, we know what we're talking about. So in terms of the SA Schools Act, a school enrolls learners for a grade. So when a learner is enrolled in a grade, the learner must successfully complete a number of subjects on the same grade level in order to progress to the next grade. So this is creating all kinds of problems, because what about a child that is actually very good in one subject, he's ahead on one subject, but he's behind on another subject? The school system cannot handle that. Sorry, there's some noise coming through.
Hello. Yeah.
Sorry, Bouwe. I just wanted to ask our guest, Gary, if he could turn off his camera and just mute himself. Thank you.
Okay, so you've got a child that's, let's say, very good in mathematics, and he can progress to the next grade. The microphone is still on mute. Not on mute.
Sorry, Bouwe, go ahead. I've muted Gary, but he can turn himself off now.
Okay, so let's say you've got a learner and he's good at mathematics and he can go to the next grade of mathematics, but is very bad at Afrikaans, for example, and he can therefore not progress. So he cannot develop his skills in the one subject before he has the other subject is on a certain level. So that is the problem with a school system that we must acknowledge. So that is what a school is. So then so that is the big orange thing. I made it big because it's the dominant form of education. But the last 20 years, a number of other what we call education modalities have emerged. So the first one is home education. You go there, there's home education, top left. It means learning outside of the public and private school environment. For most families, it involves being out and about each day, learning from diverse resources available in their community, the internet, and through interaction with other families. Home education makes it possible to customize a curriculum for each individual child. So you can decide this child does these subjects, and he can be at different grade levels on the different subjects simultaneously. So that shows you the flexibility and the capability of home education to be customized to meet the needs of a child. Then you've got a thing called collaborative home education. So that's just under home education to the left. That is homeschooling families that collaborate in their home education, and they divide the provision of education between families. So a number of families cooperate, and on Monday they go to families A's house, and there is a parent there that knows maths very well, and he teaches maths on Monday, and then Tuesday all the children go to another family, and there they do English, and so they divide, and maybe the parents at home do certain subjects on their own, but families can collaborate on home education. That's another form of home education, or that collaboration can be done in a type of center where parents visit on a regular basis. Then you've got this phenomenon called cottage school or micro school or low fee school. It's a small school, often operated from a private home, that provides education in a way that's often totally different from schools. And they make use of tutors and teachers to provide education. So, and due to the unique nature, yet many of them, they cannot register as schools because they're either too small or they're too different to meet the registration requirements of the state. Then there is a thing called co-work space. That is an outflow of the online school movement. So that is a building or a home that only provides infrastructure. So learners can come there and there is internet access, there are screens, there are computers that give them access to an online learning platform. So the people in the center do not do the education that's provided by an online platform, but the people in the center would look after the children, provide the necessary care, and they provide the infrastructure. Then you've got this thing called the online learning platform, also known as online schools. I don't like the word online school because a school has got a very different, very specific meaning. So an online school, it provides basically education online. And these platforms can be very flexible. So children, the platform will give them the information in various media, text, video, Zoom sessions, and then the system can also do assessment. And then these platforms also make use of artificial intelligence that can look at the assessment and analyze the assessment results and see, where's the weak point of this child? Okay, there's a problem there. Let's go back to that lesson from maybe a previous grade which the child didn't properly understand, fix the problem and come back. Artificial intelligence makes that possible on online learning platforms. And then you've got what I call a curriculum provider. So whereas an online learning platform provides the content and the assessment, a curriculum provider only provides the content. So parents procure content, whether it's digital or physical, from a curriculum provider, but the parents then will guide the child and say, okay, let's do lesson X today and let's do lesson Y today. And the parents will see that the child has mastered the content and decide at what pace to proceed with the curriculum. Then you've got tutor centers. These things have also popped up. They've been around many years to help children in schools. So they are basically providing support to explain certain things, and they provide their service to home educators and to schools. But they only, the thing is, they are not taking responsibility for the education of the child. They provide support when that is needed. So when a parent, let's say homeschooling parent, doesn't feel comfortable with certain materials, you then contract a tutor to assist with that. So there we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, what I call education modalities that have popped up over the last decades. They are still small compared to the public and independent school system, but they are growing fast and they are changing the landscape. So all these green bubbles, they are growing, and the orange bubble is stagnant or is deteriorating. Now, talking about these things like online platforms, cottage schools, etc. These things are not acknowledged by laws. So there's a problem. The Constitution says everyone has got the right to establish an education institution. So institution is a concept with a broad meaning. but we've only got an SA Schools Act. So the SA Schools Act is limiting our right to establish education institutions because it only acknowledges one type of institution, namely a school. So that's just a side note. So let's move on. So this is just a slide that shows how these different modalities are, as I've described, different. So you see I've divided the modalities into education providers and education consumers, and then you can see education provider can provide curriculum, it can provide assessment, and it can provide support. And you can see that these different modalities provide different things. And then you've got what I call the education consumers. So we must always remember that we think of a school, for example, is providing education. But education is just one of the things that a school provides. The school also provides daycare. So it takes care of the child during the day. And that enables the parent to work during the day. So that is why home education is not for everybody, because you need to provide full care to your children during day and night, and education. And some families cannot do that, therefore they make use of institutions to provide the care. So this is just a model to distinguish the different modalities. So now we look at the regulatory framework. And as I said, there are all these new education modalities, and you see them there. So at the bottom, you see the modalities. You've got schools, you've got home education, co-work spaces, etc. And then the blue block says the DBE and the PED. So the DBE is the Department of Basic Education, and the PEDs are the provincial education departments. So those institutions operate, regulate, and subsidize education. So the education departments, they operate public schools, they regulate public schools, they make the laws, and they also subsidize public schools as well as private schools. And that is all governed by the SA Schools Act and the Provincial Schools Act and various education regulations. So in our current regulatory framework, there's obviously all kinds of provision to operate, regulate, and subsidize schools, independent and public, and for a limited form of home education. So I'm not going to go through it, but currently the SA Schools Act actually does not allow you to really home educate and provide the education that meets the needs of your children, but tries to prescribe the curriculum you must follow and how you must assess, etc. So that's why I say that the regulatory environment only currently caters for a limited form of home education. And then you've got the other things, the co-work spaces, the tutor centers, the online platforms. They are not acknowledged by the law. The law doesn't make provision for them. So they're living in a regulatory no man's land. So the Constitution says everyone has got the right to establish and operate the education institution. But the law does not make provision for co-work spaces, tutor centers, online platforms, cottage schools, and collaborative home education. So the Constitution says children have got the right to parental care, but the SA Schools Act limits that right to the parental care that children can parents can give their children. So that is the regulatory space. So in order, and this creates a problem for the development of education solutions, because it is dangerous to invest in an online education platform or cottage schools or whatever, because of the regulatory uncertainty. Yet the minister can easily decide that this is illegal, and a businessman doesn't want to invest in something that's illegal. So because of the regulatory no man's land in which these institutions live, development is limited. So now we can go to the government and say, government, we've got a problem. There's a new education landscape. We must reform education. But there are some obstacles to this. If we want to reform education, what are we going to reform? Are we going to change the SA Schools Act? The problem is the SA Schools Act was designed to regulate schools. If you now change the SA Schools Act to cater for home education, you're using a law designed for schools to regulate something that's non-school. So you can see we need a totally different dispensation, where we'll have laws that will regulate and provide oversight into a variety of education modalities that are written for those modalities. We can't have a Schools Act regulating something that's not a Schools Act. So that's the one obstacle, that everything in education is currently regulated by the SA Schools Act. Then no consulting bodies for emerging modalities. So there is a law called the National Education Policy Act. That act describes how the minister must determine policy and regulations and legislation. So it determines that if the minister wants to make legislation, it has to consult with certain bodies. Now, there are currently no consulting bodies, formally acknowledged consulting bodies of home education, online schools. So if the government wants to consult with a sector for online schools, for example, it's just not possible. There is no formally recognized consulting body for that. So that makes it difficult for government to consult. So we will need to amend the National Education Policy Act, or NEPA, to make provision for consulting bodies. Thirdly, there's very little research. If you want to make legislation, you must base your legislation on research. There's almost no research on home education, online schools, and those things in South Africa. And then, if you now, point D, if you ask the government, please draft some education. Let's say we've solved points A, B, and C. The officials in government that must draft the legislation do not have any understanding or expertise in all these new emerging modalities. They come from unions, they come from schools. And then lastly, our education sector is very much determined by vested interests of powerful players. And there the unions is one of the biggest ones. So those are the obstacles that we've got to get regulatory reforms. So there are various proposals floating around to solve the problem, and I'm just going to list some of them. And one of them is the one mentioned in the booklet by the Free Market Foundation. But I'm just going to give you an overview of all the solutions I've stumbled across in the education sector. So currently, there is the BELA bill. That's the Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill. That's currently in Parliament. And as we sit here, the Portfolio Committee of Basic Education is currently busy with oral hearings on that bill. So that is what they see as the solution for education in South Africa. But all that Bellable does, it entrenches the current failed system of education. But anyway, that is their proposal. Then there are some home educators that say, let's make some small changes to Bellable to provide a bit more freedom for home education. So that is proposed by some home education. Then there is the solution of vouchers. Let's give parents vouchers and they can use it at a school and choose the school that's best for their child. So that is something I wholeheartedly support, but a voucher system cannot be implemented if the industry is not liberated yet. If there is no regulatory certainty for the diversity of educational modalities, then a voucher can be like democracy in the Soviet Union. We'll give you a voucher and you can use it, or you can vote, but you can only vote for a candidate of the Communist Party. So we must first free up the education space to make provision for all the modalities before you can do vouchers. And vouchers obviously creates a dynamic free market a mechanism where people can choose what works for them. Then there's the idea of having the education space regulated by an independent regulator. So it's a regulatory environment similar to what we've got in telecommunications and also to a certain extent in energy. You've got an independent regulator that regulates a sector in which various role players can play. Then there are also proposal that let's take home education out of the Schools Act, because the Schools Act is not appropriate for home education, and let's manage home education under the Children's Act, and then it's the responsibility of a Department of Social Services, which could work for home education. Then last one that I stumbled upon is the idea of separate education authorities, promoted by GHA, die Genootskap vir Handhaving van Afrikaans, saying different communities have got different ideas. Let's have a Department of Education for different communities. So those are the proposals that are being promoted by various organizations. What I see is the common thread of most of these proposals is it proposes a solution that is designed for a specific modality in mind. So parent vouchers can work very well for improving the school system, but it doesn't help for education outside the school system. So we must think of a solution that will work for all modalities. So I've just got some high-level proposals of how one could move forward. If we want to move forward in education, what should be the principles? So the first one is we must acknowledge there is no silver bullet. Fixing the school system is not the solution. It's the solution for some. Home education is not the solution for all. It's a solution for some. Cottage schools, so there's a diversity of solutions that can work for different people. So there's not a single silver bullet. The other thing is when we look at the education space, currently what we've got, and it's also been the case in other industries, if you want to register independent school or you want to register for home education, you must ask for permission and register with the Department of Basic Education. So that means the Department of Basic Education is simultaneously the operator of public schools, but also the regulator of non-public schools. And that is an unfair environment. We must create an environment where the roles of operator and regulator are split. So if we're thinking of a solution, that is a principle it must comply to. Then regulation through appropriate laws. I've already addressed that. So if we want to have regulatory reform in education, it cannot be done by modifying the SA Schools Act. We must think of a totally new dispensation where the SA Schools Act can be used to regulate schools, but other laws will be needed to regulate other modalities. Then I've already touched on, if government wants to reform the education sector, it must be able to engage with representative bodies. Currently, there are very little representative bodies available there are, let's say, homeschool associations and curriculum provider associations, but they are not formally recognized and acknowledged in the National Education Policy Act. So we must establish representative bodies that can talk to government and that government is obliged to consult. And then we need extensive independent research, because you cannot make laws without basing on the research. Otherwise, you're creating laws based on a flawed perception of reality. So that is what I've got to say. That's my last slide.
Bouwe, thank you very much indeed for that very comprehensive presentation. I appreciate you giving us your time and all the trouble that you've been to. Perhaps you could keep your camera on if you don't mind, so we can see your face when you're dealing with questions.
My camera is on, as far as I know.
No, your camera's off at the moment. I'm not sure why. But
I'll stop sharing, but my camera
there you
is
are.
on.
You're back. We've got you. Thank you. I'm sure there are going to be some questions. All of our guests, you can either, if you like, type a question into the chat room, which is going to be managed by either Zakeli or myself, or if you want to put up your hand and ask obviously a verbal question, you're free to do that. Just unmute yourself at the same time. Bouwe, if I could just start, as I've got the floor at the moment. I was interested in, I think it takes somebody who's quite brave to move away from standardized education, which I guess is the easy way to educate people. You know, these are the rules, this is the book, this is the exam, into, I think, what you referred to as custom-made education that really suits every single individual child. And I'd like to commend the homeschoolers for that. And I'm assuming, obviously, this can also be done at other private institutions who are more flexible and provide more choice and competition in the marketplace and so on. But I found that interesting. I see we have a question from Ron. Ron?
So, sorry, can I comment on you first? It's a very important thing that you say. And that's exactly what we see in home education, that when you start off in home education, you follow a formal curriculum, CAPS curriculum, whatever, that's divided into subjects and so on. And as you progress, you build more confidence and you start mixing and matching, going towards totally different education forms, like what they call unschooling, where you say the education must not be prescribed by a program, but by the interest of the child. So yeah, everybody is like that, but especially in home education, you learn the ropes as you go along. So our family was like that. We started with formal, and then it became more and more informal over time.
And I'm assuming in the process you deliver into society young adults who are passionate about something and knowledgeable about that thing and wanting to work in that space and you know, do so in a more productive way than perhaps people who've been bored to death through 10 years of school. Ron, I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Let me check. Am I being heard? Okay.
You're being heard and seen.
Very good. I'm so glad to be connected we run a Mancal Economic Education Foundation over here in Perth, and we're an active member of the Atlas Network. And I've known some of your team. I've known Leon, and my regards to Eustace, I see is on the list here. And Atlas, I see, have got a couple of events planned with your foundation later in 2023. So we were discussing with Atlas why we're not doing much. We're sort of in the same part of the world, you might say. And I went chasing, and I found that your regular newsletters go to my secretary, Judy Carroll. So hence my request to you. She's very protective of me, and I haven't been receiving anything from you. Hence my request that they be transferred across to my name. But getting to my question, we are running our own, we call it the New Education Project. We've got two very, very leading academics putting a paper together, and I'd like to share that with your team, and I'd like to check that this session today in particular, and the previous and future ones, I noticed that you're recording them. Does that mean they're accessible from your website, so I could get our two academic lecturers that are working on this paper with us to catch up and link in and have the benefit of hearing what you're doing there, because we've got the same concerns.
Yes, thank you, Ron. Yes, the material is available on a website, and I will share it with you directly after this. We're putting up all 8 of the booklets. They're available in PDF form, so you can download them and print them. They can be read on the site, and there's a link, of course, to each of the presentations from our fantastic speakers. So we will be doing that later.
I'm so glad, and it's so nice to catch up with you. I'll drop off now and give somebody else a turn.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have a question? I'm not sure. Let me just have a look at this. Okay, I have a question in the chat room for you, Bouwe. What are your thoughts on how the customization of education can be expanded to higher education within the context of having calls for the standardization of training among teachers, for example, with regard to some form of standardized global benchmark? Gosh, that sounds complicated. I hope you can manage that.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on higher education. So I think in higher education, there is not a single prescribed curriculum for, let's say, the different universities. So universities have got the freedom to decide what courses they are offering. So the universities look at the market and say, there's a need for tourism. Let's develop a degree in tourism, and they develop the courses, and then they have to go through a whole process of having that benchmarked or whatever, and then they offer that course. So I think there is much more freedom when that comes in higher education. But I think I want to make an important point. The word standardization, that is in basic education, our problem is the current SA Schools Act says, and the Constitution also says, if you run an independent school, your education must be of a certain standard. But we must acknowledge that when two things are on the same standard, the content can still be vastly different. So you can have third-year philosophy and third-year maths and third-year sociology. The content and methodologies used in those areas are totally different, but they are all third-year level. So standard refers to something different than content. So when we want to impose standards. It must be, it must have, I'm not an expert on this, on assessment, so, but it must refer to the standard of education, the amount of cognitive capabilities you need to master the content. It should not prescribe content. So making sure everybody complies to the same standard still allows for a diversity of content. So, and that is what we're fighting against. We're not opposed to good standards, but we want freedom in how you provide the education and what the content of the education is, to be in line with what the interests of your child are, what your religious and philosophical convictions are. I hope that sort of answers the question to a certain extent.
Thank you for that, Bouwe. Are there any other questions from our guests? You can either just pop up your hand, or if you unmute yourself and start speaking, I'll know that you're there. All right, it seems that we've reached the end. I think that you covered so much, there wasn't need for more than that. Thank you very much indeed. So again, just a big thank you to you. I really appreciate you coming on board. It's the first time we've met, but I'm hoping it's not the last. And all the best to you. Thank you to all our guests as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.